Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we have got a great guest on, Andy McNiel. He's going to be awesome on the show because he has worked with so many families and so many people who've dealt with grief and loss. And we are going to talk about grief tasks, some real stuff that you can do. You can dig in with your family and some ideas that will help you.
I know Andy fairly well, I've got to say, and he is a leading expert in the world on grief and loss. He is very, very well known in the field. He right now is serving as the interim executive director for the Compassionate Friends. I was on their board for 8 years working with him, and he has been absolutely incredible for the organization. Andy is a member of the International Workgroup on Death, Dying, and Bereavement. He is the co-founder of the Satori Group, a national education management and consulting company. He is a board member for ADEC, the Association for Death Educators and Counselors. He is the former CEO of the National Alliance of Grieving Children. He co-authored a book with Pamela Gabbay called Supporting and Understanding Bereaved Children. And he is a trainer for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the Boys and Girls Club of America. This is not all, but this is all I'm going to say today because he is very, very involved on a national and international level in the grief and loss world. And we are totally honored to have him today. So hi, Andy, welcome.
Hi Heidi and Gloria. It's really special to be on the show with you guys today. I've been looking forward to this.
Talk about parent-child grief tasks. After a loss, what can families do?
Yeah. Well, this is an area that has been very close to my heart in my own clinical practice over the years. I've recognized early on that when parents would bring their children or teenagers in for counseling after someone died, that the parent would then wait in the waiting room, and I might check in at the end of the session with them. What I realized is that the families that were most successful in navigating their grief and being able to adapt to the changes, all of the changes that we know that loss brings into our lives. Say you have a family where a spouse has died, or perhaps that one of the children have died, and the parents they're exhausted, they're grieving themselves. And in a situation where it's a spouse who dies, the surviving spouse is now having to do everything in the home. And so you have people who are mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally just exhausted and really feeling like I can't even connect with my own children. I don't know how to help them, yet alone have conversations about the loss. How do we return to a sense of some sort of normalcy in our home after a death?
Especially how to, like you said, return to a sense of normalcy. I mean, how do we do that?
Right. Well, so part of what I developed over the years working with families is I started to see these reoccurring themes, and I looked at them as tasks that families go through in that process of adapting after a death. And so was able to sort of, put some thought to each of these areas. And what it does for parents, I found that parents were struggling they were attempting to interact with their kids the way they had always interacted with their kids prior to the death. And the issue is the home has changed now. The family has changed. Again, everyone's grieving. So parents felt like my kids won't talk to me. And I'd say to parents all the time, well, what kids do talk to their parents? Like, you ask your kids how they're doing and you get, I'm okay, fine, I don't know, and there's no further communication. So parents would become exhausted because the only tool they were using to try to connect with their kids was talk. And there's so many more things that we can do with the home environment. So, a couple of these, for me, one of the big areas that I saw was the need for homes to establish, some to establish, but some to reestablish a sense of security and safety in the home. Children, after someone dies, they are acutely aware that the people in their life can die. Mm-hmm. And that's scary for children. They know if it's a parent who dies, they know that the other parent could die. And so quite often children will go to their parent and say, the surviving parent, and say, you know, what happens to me if something happens to you? And the typical response a parent might make in that is to say to their child, well, you don't have to worry about that. I'm planning on being around a long time, right? And that's quite often the message that's given. And it's given out of love. So don't hear me passing judgment. They say that because they love their kids and they don't want their kids to worry. The issue is that the kids know that they can't make that promise. And so there's some steps that I used to work through with families. One being, what is your plan? What is the plan for the children if something were to happen to you? So that the conversation could be very different. You could say to your children, you know what? I'm making healthy choices. I'm doing everything I can to keep myself safe so that I'll be with you for a long time. You'll have to put up with me for a long time, right? But if something did happen to me, here's what would happen to you. And you tell them you would go to live with. And you have a plan. You know who those people are. You've spoken with those folks. What I found with kids is kids would get excited because they think about the people, and it's typically people who they loved and cared for. And then they would feel a sense of security knowing that whatever happens in life, I am going to be taken care of. And that relieves that sense.
Wow, you know, that's really good because that's a kind of thing that people want to avoid. You know, oh, let's not let them think that anything could happen to me. I'm, you know, totally invincible. And they know you're not because they just lost somebody. So having a plan and speaking the unspeakable is.
It is so big. And Andy, I have to tell you, when I worked with the 9/11 families, the firefighter families, this was the biggest thing. The firefighter fathers had died 9/11. They now had only one parent. And this was probably one of the bigger issues we had. The kids had so much anxiety around the idea that they'd lost a dad suddenly and that suddenly their mom was going to die. And I love that you're saying, go move into it. Don't avoid it. You know, you can be sure that you're taking care of yourself, but then you need to go further than that and say, in the event that anything happens, Aunt Susie's going to take care of you or whoever. And that will alleviate some of that anxiety.
But let me say, I would think that you don't want to say it too many times. One activity is enough. I mean, you don't need to keep telling them, you know, if anything happens to me, you know.
I agree.
You've got to make sure the parents aren't when you do this, don't be an overly anxious parent.
Yeah.
Well, and the way I talked about it with parents is to say, this is an exercise that you do, particularly when your child comes to you and says, this is my concern. Okay. And children, right. And other thing is, so we, you know, you don't have to go overboard, certainly not. But at the same time, I would say to parents, some children, particularly younger children, will have to hear it repeated, not because you're deciding it should be repeated, but they may come to you multiple times and say, now tell me again what would happen if they may ask you that again, and you stay with what that is, and you stay with comforting words, and I'm here with you, and you reassure that is part of it. Another thing that I would see sometimes in siblings when a child would die, particularly in younger children and really, quite honestly, even in the older children as well, is they now were acutely aware that people their age can die, that children can die as well. And so needing reassurance from parents, you know, well, what about me? You know, what if, you know, could this happen to me? And quite often we would talk about how you can have conversations with your child. Say you have a child who died from cancer, and their siblings were part of all of this process. Their lives were also impacted and then worried. Part of it is to be able to open up some of that communication and talk very clearly about something that may be difficult to talk about.
And that's why I don't think it's helpful for children to hear she died peacefully in her sleep, because that gives you often say that as adults because it's comforting, but for children, they think, oh my gosh, if I go to sleep, will I die? So like you said, having candid conversations, I think, is really key.
So once you have that plan in place, you're reestablishing a sense of security and safety. Another piece to that is you make sure that you have routines in order. And that's part of, actually, we call it restoring routines is the other area.
I like that.
Because routines get turned upside down. These routines, you think about when someone dies, if a parent dies, say it was the parent that drove the kids to school. Say it was the parent that's home after school and greets the kids, right? Everyone plays different roles in their life, and there are certain routines that are directly impacted by the loss. And so kids do better when life is predictable. And a death actually reminds us that life isn't always predictable. And then quite often homes can become a bit chaotic. And so part of even helping them feel secure and safe, this is tied to that. If you can have certain routines and you put them in place. And so here's what I would do with families is we would have a family session, and we would sit down with a big piece of butcher paper and put it in the center of the counseling room on the floor. And the kids would get down there and they would kind of be recording everything. And we would talk about, let's talk about your week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we'd spell it out. What does a typical week look like in your home? What do you do on Mondays? What do you do on Tuesdays? What does that look like? And because quite often parents are just overwhelmed. They're like, there's way too much to do. And so helping families to create a habit of starting their week before they get into the week, maybe a Sunday evening, something before the week gets going, that they take about 30 minutes with their kids and they talk about the week. After a death, quite often, because a parent is grieving, and everyone's having a hard time. So again, this isn't judging anyone. It's very difficult. Quite often, discipline becomes difficult for the surviving parent for a number of reasons. Parents struggle because they feel bad that their kids feel bad, and they don't want to punish a child for grieving, right? Often, sometimes it is just being tired. And so I have had so many children who would come into counseling, and yeah, they were grieving, and that was a big part of their issue, but they also had a lack of boundaries, and you know, it's kind of like the kids were running the household in a way, and it can turn into that. It could turn into, and kids, I don't know that it's intentional, but they will take advantage of any space you give. They'll take advantage of all that space as much as they can get. They'll take it.
And sometimes, Andy, if you've lost a spouse, you might elevate, one of the kids might fill that role and become parentified. And also, if you've lost the child, I know as a sibling, sometimes the oldest child, or one of the children will see that the parents are grieving, and they will become too empowered.
One of the things I would say to parents with this, though, is you can't punish grief. That's the first piece. There still has to be consequences, right? So what I would teach parents is a way to talk to their children, if they have to discipline them, to say, I noticed that you, whatever it was that they're doing, I'm having a hard time since Daddy died, and I'm sure you probably are having a hard time as well. And I want you to know that I understand it's hard. It's hard on all of us. So you acknowledge the grief, and then you say, but it is never okay to. Mm-hmm. And whatever the behavior is that it's not okay to do, you just fill that in. I have been having a difficult time since Daddy died, or whoever it was that died. And I understand you may be having a difficult time too. I see this as a new behavior for you. And maybe it has to do with your grief. And you acknowledge that, right? So you acknowledge the grief. And then you say, but it is never okay to, and you say whatever the action was.
Awesome.
And then you say what the consequence is going to be, and then you come back to the grief and say, here's the consequences. I'm doing this because I love you, like you would if anytime you're putting consequences in a child's life. And then you come back to the grief and say, and I want you to know that I'm here for you, and we can talk. If you're upset like this again, please, you can come to me. If there's any tip, and it has to do with parenting and your kids, is never assume you know why your child is behaving the way that they're behaving. And if you don't understand their behavior, and you would like to understand it better, I would encourage what I call participating with them in child-led play. And it's not something I came up with. It's something we do in the childhood grief field. If I'm working with a child, I let them lead me in the play. I don't ask them questions. I don't ask them how they're doing, how their day was, all the typical questions we ask as parents. What I do instead is I sit down with them and I say, what would you like to do today? And then they tell me, and then I say, what would you like me to do while you're doing that? And then they tell me what they want me to do while that's happening. And we just spend time together. Now, you may be dressed up in all kinds of kids' clothes and, get ready because you're going to join their world. But when you do, it will bring you such relief as a parent because you'll get to know your child. You'll get to know what's really going on with them. As a family, you can live through and you can even thrive even through a loss, even though you'll continue to grieve. It does not have to derail your child's or your future.
Oh, I love it, Andy. Thank you so much. What a great note to close on. Now tell people how to get your book and give us the name of it again, because this book's just filled with wisdom for you guys.
So the title of the book is Understanding and Supporting Bereaved Children. My co-author is Pamela Gabbay. You can get that through Springer Publishers. You can also get it on Amazon or really anywhere that you can get books if you type that title in. It is written for professionals, but we wrote it for professionals about how to help families. So if you are a family member, all the information's in there that we would have written to you as well.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for being on the show and for all the wonderful work you do.
Thank you, Andy.
Well, thank you
for all the work you're doing around the world. It's just phenomenal.
And thanks everybody for watching and listening to the show. And Heidi and I and Andy want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.